Everyone is familiar with the sight of birds sitting on power lines. Our beloved feathered friends blatantly disregard the warnings from Louis the Lightning Bug for the chance to perch on power lines. But what makes power lines such perfect roosting locations? And is it even safe for birds to sit on power lines in the first place? I'll address all these questions soon, but let's start off with some familiar birds that perch on power lines. Some common species that can be seen on power lines include starlings, blackbirds such as red-winged blackbirds or meadowlarks, doves like pigeons and mourning doves, and raptors such as red-tailed hawks and common buzzards, just to name a few. Clearly, plenty of birds can be seen on power lines, but it's worth investigating the danger that birds put themselves in when they decide to sit on power lines. So, how risky is it for birds to sit on power lines? Well, it turns out that the mere act of sitting on power lines is not very dangerous for birds. This may be so because power lines are only risky if a creature touches multiple power lines simultaneously, or touches a power line while making contact with a solid surface like the ground. This means that a bird would be in trouble if they made contact with a power line while sitting atop a solid wooden pole that connects the lines. For the most part, perching on power lines is completely safe for birds. However, this doesn't mean that power lines aren't a danger to birds. Unfortunately, power lines are responsible for killing significant numbers of birds that have the misfortune of colliding with them. Power lines pose minimal risk to small birds that can quickly adjust to avoid them, but they can be disastrous for larger birds like swans, raptors, and cranes that don't often have time to react when subtle power lines suddenly appear. In fact, about 20% of all dead whooping cranes recovered from their wintering grounds in Texas were killed by power line collisions in a lengthy study. Fortunately, there are lots of new ideas to make power lines more visible to birds in heavily used migratory corridors. Okay, so we've established that power lines are fairly safe for birds that are merely interested in sitting on them, but I've not yet gotten to the root of why birds are so keen on sitting on power lines. What advantages do birds receive from sitting on power lines? Well, some studies have found that power lines can act as a perching substitute for certain adaptable bird species in areas where substantial amounts of trees have been lost. The specific benefits that birds incur from power lines can be broken down into two main advantages: safe roosting habitat and hunting perches. Many birds undoubtedly consider power lines to be safe locations for perching, as these structures provide elevated locations that offer unobstructed views of the surrounding area. This makes it very difficult for predators to sneak up on birds resting on power lines. On the flip side, when birds get hungry, these same aspects of power lines work in their favor. Avifauna from robins to raptors will happily use power lines as platforms from which they can hunt for their foods of choice. Some birds may even construct nests using the wooden poles that connect power lines as a base. Feral populations of monk parakeets are one of the most prominent examples of birds using power lines for nesting. Naturally, birders are most interested in how power lines impact birds, but few consider that birds can also have detrimental impacts on power lines. For example, some species of finch and other small songbirds have been observed plucking threads from power lines. Additionally, numerous woodpecker species are known to bore holes into the wooden poles that often support power lines. Overall, the damage inflicted by birds onto power lines is minimal, but it's still something to consider. So where does this leave us on the topic of birds and power lines? What's the verdict? Are power lines more of a benefit or a negative for birds? Well, although power lines have been known to contribute to the growth of certain bird populations, the cons generally outweigh the pros. Power lines are responsible for the deaths of many large bird species that collide with them. In some cases, important bird habitat is cleared to make way for the installation of power lines. Ultimately, power lines aren't going anywhere, so it will be important for scientists to continue finding ways to minimize the impact that these structures can have on birds.